Okay, next one. All right, next one. Okay, that's good.
My name is Lou Anderson. Huh? Not yet? Okay, you tell.
Get a little. Get a little. Get some big.
My name is Lou Anderson, and I live at Grand Portage, Minnesota. What you see here before you is an artifact collection made by the Indians. We have collected this for about 15 to 17 years. How we got started on this is the first one I found. We were duck hunting in this area, which is the South Fall area, which is the headwaters of the Pigeon River. The first one I found, which is this arrowhead, really excited me because, as you see, it's very perfect. After that, a lot of times I wasn't so fortunate. I'd find pieces that were broken, but still, they mean so terribly much when you consider the work and the history behind them. We have several areas that are covered here. The stone collection, and we also have the copper collection. That will be explained by my son, Rick. Rick?
I'm Rick Anderson. And before we start, I'd just like to mention that these artifacts it's a hobby, but more than a hobby, it's a real interest. And it's interesting because it's a collection of tools used by early man. And man has been on the North American continent now, archaeologists say, for almost 10,000 years. And the way they came down, there was a natural migration route after the glaciers receded, and the land which is now Siberia and Alaska was connected by just a short causeway of land. So supposedly early man walked across there, came down, and followed the natural watershed which starts at Lake Athabasca and ends up at what's called South Fowl Lake. And South Fowl Lake is a site where we found these. And some of our artifacts date from, this is a point, it dates from 4,500 to 7,000 BC. It's a Lancelot point, it's called, and is dated by the Minnesota Historical Society. And other points we have also are that area, but what I'd like to talk about now is the native copper that was found at this site. About 22 miles from Grand Portage is what's called Isle Royal, and Isle Royal is an island, largest island in Lake Superior. And on the island are some of the largest deposits of native copper in the world. And native copper is copper that has no copper sulfate, it's just pure copper, and so it's easily malleable, it's easy to get to, and there's no refining that has to be done. And I have here a piece of native copper that comes from Isle Royal, and it's solid copper. And the way the people used to get this copper from the island was build a fire next to a big chunk of copper, and this would heat up the copper. Then they'd pour water on it. If there were any rock around it, the rock would shatter, and with a hammerstone pound off this copper until they'd have a chunk like this. And I imagine this is a pretty valuable piece of copper because you could make a lot of artifacts out of it. And I have now this was just say a native piece of copper. This next piece of copper has been tooled somewhat. It's edged, and you could tell it was being made into an artifact, till eventually it possibly could have become, say, a spear or a much larger knife like this. And again, part of the fun of collecting is speculating as to how these were used. This has a handle on it that has a hook on it that you could tell was probably used for say a shaft of bone or a wooden handle. And it's fun to visualize. Maybe this knife it was really shiny and may have had a nice bone or wooden handle on it. And other artifacts used, this has been in a fire somehow because it's been tempered and it's bent. But this has a little cutting edge on it. And again, its use, I don't really know what the use is, but there was a lot of wildlife around here, and that's how the people lived. They would kill these animals and use them for their hide, they'd use them for meat, and that was their livelihood. So this could have been used for, because it's easy to hone down an edge on this copper and it would hold. So say it could have been used for a cutting tool, or even more so, you could have almost cut through bone with this. And here's another knife. And this knife is interesting because if you follow the theory that the first native people to North America came down from Siberia, today there's the Eskimos that are still up there. And they have a knife which is similar to this, that has a crescent shape like this. And this knife even today is usable, to where if you're going to take a hide, you can simply peel it like this. Whereas with a knife, it's much more work, and this way it's more effortless. And I know you could have gotten a really sharp edge on this too. And this is kind of an unusual. The Minnesota Historical Society classified this as, they call it unusual socketed fishhook, but it's got a socket on it, which probably would have been socketed to a piece of wood somehow, and used as some kind of a gaff. And other examples we have of gaffed fish hooks are these, which are pretty big fish hooks. You can catch a big fish with this. And if this would have been gaffed, there probably would have been a shaft somehow, and then it would have been bound to the shaft to where you could use it in the spring to gaff fish. And here's another long point. This has another shaft. It's fluted on the end. So a shaft would have been inserted where my finger is and either thrown or used somehow with a bow. And these are good examples of shafted points. It's much like arrows you buy today. It's got a point to it, and then it's got a shaft, and the shaft would have been inserted like this. And we've got quite a few of these.
Jewelry.
Yeah. Oh, we've got some jewelry here too. This is a perfect example. This is a copper bracelet, and it's, who knows who wore it and what significance it had, but it was used for ornament. And the way jewelry was made, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a line in the center, and it's been twisted around that. Here, maybe I can explain it better this way. It was flattened out. This is a piece of copper that was tooled until it was really flat. So after you get this flat piece of copper, you roll those in the center to where it looks like this maybe, and that's how the jewelry was made. Another example of this is a small ring. And again, it's hard to speculate how they wore the rings, on fingers or through other parts of the body, but this was jewelry. Other types of ornamentation is, I think this is more recent. This is made out of brass, but this was probably worn on the clothing, and it's a clinker or something like that it's called. But you wear these in a string like this, and they make a kind of a clinking noise. And here's a point that's kind of interesting. This is the only artifact we have that's made out of iron, and it's not a trade item. So I know somebody who's an archaeologist, and he said maybe it could be Norsk, which again is hard. There's been evidence of white men on the North American continent before the Christopher Columbus story. And Leif Erikson supposedly had landed in Newfoundland and then even made his way up in the lake, and there's a stone in southwestern Minnesota called the Kensington Ruin Stone, which has Norsk on it. So that's this is authentic, but I'm not really sure if this is or not. I'm going to send this into the university. But this has the same kind of design. It has a shaft, as you can see here. And the same concept is this, that's also shafted. Here's an example of other parts of the world. This is from the Susie mine, which is just 4 miles from where we're sitting now. And this is copper, but it's copper sulfate. And they had no technology, so to get the copper out of this rock, you'd have to crush it and process it. So they had, you know, some of the finest copper in the world to work with. And I have a book here. It's called Prehistoric Copper Mining in the Lake Superior region, and in here is a series of essays. And some of these essays talk about the fact that native copper has been found in places as far away as Egypt, South America, Central America, and even a lot of times attribute a lot of the mining of the copper to the Aztecs. But so far, there's not any evidence to support this, because there's 1.5 billion pounds of copper taken from the Isle Royale area, and they found very little of it. Let's see, what else we got? Oh, we got... The Indians used a lot of animals for food and for the hides, and when they take the animal, they scrape the hide. They'd use the hide, they'd use the meat, but when they'd use the hide, these are called punches or awls, and it's like a little needle. And if you were going to sew two hides together, you just punch, and then you'd have a hole, and it's just like sewing. So we've got a large collection of these needles and punches. Here's a really good one too. And this has 4 sides to it. This isn't rounded. I guess that's it.
Is that all right?
No, that's not. We can go right ahead.
I'd like to show you this one tool that we have here. It's our oldest tool. Ricky made a referral to it a short time ago. This is called a lanceolate spear point. You can tell about the authenticity of it. If you'll notice, it has the parallel flaking extending across. And you can see how that differs from the more recent thing where they would chip on the sides and would chip underneath. Ricky will show you later how that was accomplished too. This dates back to 3,500 to 7,000 years before Christ. These have been found in the remains with the bison, that some of them are now extinct in the plains regions. And since I'm a woman here, I'm going to show some of the pieces that I'm sure the squad had to work with. This one in particular interests me. As you'll notice, they have thumb indentations. So I'm sure that they'd put their thumb in this, grasp it, and would use as a cutting tool. Rick mentioned that they had to tie thongs to some of their implements, and I can visualize one of them using this for a tool. And because there is so much workmanship on a lot of these tools that you see, I'm sure that they were multi-purpose, because it did take an awful lot of work. They wouldn't use them just for one thing. I'm sure this was used for many, many things. And another thing here that interests me, being a woman, I always have to wet my stones, as I'm sure anyone that is interested in stones do. If you take a stone, it'll show here where the indentations are for the hands. When you do find things, you have to use your imaginations. A lot of time I'll pick up things, and you move your hands around different places and say, aha, it fits. When I found this is a scraper for hides and also a multi-purpose tool. As you can see, the hand fits exactly, and they would use this for a tool. And some of the smaller tools we have here are fitted for small hands. This has an awful lot of workmanship on it. Each edge is chipped in minute, tiny, tiny chippings. This would be used for cutting and probably for fine scraping the hides, because it is very sharp and it gradually goes where you can visualize that it would take whatever needs to be removed from the hides. And here's an interesting piece here. This is unusual rock. You can see where they have run into a flaw. So instead of finishing both parts, they would utilize what there is here and finish off the edges and still have a complete tool. And some of the, what we call the chips, when you'd find these, you'd think they wouldn't be much. But if you look closely, they are all worked, they are all flaked, and again, I call these my squaw tools because they're very sharp and they would do the fine work. This is a very interesting tool. It shows the ingenuity of the peoples. They worked into the natural bends, natural flaws, whatever you have on a rock. This one even has the curvature of the rock. And they utilized all sides of it. Maybe you can see it better this way. For the curvature. This is one of our more recent finds. This is from the Devil's Track Lake area, which is 7 miles from Grand Marais. And the workmanship is very crude in comparison to some of our older pieces. And why? We don't really know. If they were busy, if they were on the move, if they're at war, didn't have the time. You just have to use your imagination a little bit on that. And some of the other tools that you see here, you'd probably walk right by them. Unless you have to use your imagination a lot. But as you can see, some of these were probably just natural things that they would find. But they didn't have to do any work on this, and your ends were there, your handhold was there, so you can see, again, I use my grip and my imagination to see that they would use these as a tool. This one is similar. Here is a good example of another tool, a cutting tool. They probably ran into a flaw on this side. It isn't complete, but If you notice again, all the edges are work. They wouldn't throw that away. I'm going to turn it over to my son Rick, and he will explain from this friend of his the process that they are almost sure that they use to make arrowheads. Rick?
Yeah. We've displayed some of this in Grand Marais at a place called the Trading Post, and there was just a few pieces there. And one afternoon, a guy called up and said, "I'm interested in looking at your artifacts." So he came over and found out that he's an anthropologist, archaeologist, and he also makes his own artifacts. And so he showed me how you make the artifacts. And first of all, I'll just explain some of the rock here that was used in these artifacts we found. This is a simple crude axe, and this is out of jasper, and jasper is a really pretty red stone. And we've got a lot of artifacts out of jasper, everything from, well, you can't see that this is almost a purplish red to almost a blood red in some of these artifacts, like this. And other stones that are used, it's kind of interesting because this is, as Mom said, the first point that was found, this is out of what's called chert, and chert isn't a native stone to the area. The places you find chert are the central United States. You find it in Illinois, Iowa, Ohio. So you could probably guess that there was some kind of a trade route between here and down south. And other tools are made out of flint. And flint is a native stone, and flint is really a soft stone. You could chip it very easily. So I'll explain now how St. Clair explained to me how artifacts were made. This is a stone, and this is out of a chert. That this wasn't used for an artifact, but the other half of the rock would have been used for an artifact. And he had some tools that were similar to native tools. Now, this would be an antler from either a deer, and at the time they had caribou up here, elk. But antler is hard, and with this end, you'd grab it like this, and you'd take say this was a large piece of chert or something, you'd take it, and you'd hit it like this, and it would be called percussion bulb. You'd get a chip, which would be this chip, and then you'd get another chip, which would be, where was that one with the curved one? Well, it's like this. You get a concave curve to it. So the other half would be like this, and you get a bulb here, and you get a little twist to it. So you already have one edge that's really sharp, and all you'd have to do is flake it this side, and you'd have an even sharper edge. So once you get the other piece of rock, you take a tool, which would either be bone or antler or else a piece of wood. And he used copper wire instead of a point, but I've got a point here that was much similar to what he was using with copper wire. Somehow you'd attach that, and with this stone, this is another artifact making tool, you take a point like any point that's somewhat crude. I'll use a big one because it's even cruder. And with this antler again, you'd hit it, say you hit the stone on this side, you'd hit it like this, and the opposite side you get a flake going off this way. So you'd hit it again on this side, you get a flake on the bottom, turn it over, you get a flake on the top. So this way you're making it like this. So once you get that, you take, this is a real porous stone, this isn't a native stone, it's like sandstone. And you file down a rough edge like this until you get a kind of like a little platform kind of thing, a place where you can set that point. And he showed me, he had a little piece of skin, and he put the stone in like this, hold it, and put pressure, like say on this point that I just smoothed down, put pressure on it like this, and you get a real small flake. You could get just a paper thin flake that would ripple all the way across. So that's how they finally finished these off. You'd hold it like this, put pressure this way, and on the top you get a little ripple, a little flake, and that's how the flaking came about. But that's why this again is the lanceolate point is so unusual, because the flaking is so perfect. You get a perfect flake that starts on this side, it ripples all the way around to the other side. And it's perfect. They're all parallel flakes like this. So as the tools, like say this is our oldest, as the tools get more recent, they get more crude. It seems like here's a more recent point, and this is really crude. So it's hard to say why they got more crude, but the older the point, it seems, the more perfect the workmanship. So others examples of here's another good example of how you get a concave effect. And this would have been hit off a piece of rock that was like this. So you hit it directly here, and this would have flaked off. You would have ended up with a piece of rock like this. And this side wouldn't be used, and this side would. But other artifact making tools I have, which is this is a small hammerstone, and you can tell this has been hit for either chipping or else making that percussion bulb. But here's a stone here too that you could tell was used for grinding. It's easily held in the hand, and you can tell it was rubbed. If you can see it this way, you can see that it's been worked this way, and it's also been worked this way, so it was either ground like this or else like this. And could have been used for grinding wild rice. It could have been used for grinding meat, something like that. And this is an axe that was used. And this is out of flint as well. And this is a beauty, and I'll turn this back to Mom because she's got a good story that goes along with this, but this is a real beauty.
Ricky talking about the story. I've been looking in this area for so long, and this was a new area. And the boats had been going through this area for so long, and we were duck hunting. It was a stormy day, and I thought, well, I'll just go down into the cedar swamp and look around. And with the film, you can't notice the discoloration in the flint. But I was looking, and I spotted this one little thing that just didn't look right there. And I looked down, and I started digging, and I pulled this perfect specimen, a flint knife, which is very old. This is almost prehistoric, up. And I almost lost my cookies. I was so excited. And this is really, really quite a find. You can see where the canoes through the years and boats have made indentations. They're still aluminum. I thought it was silver at first, but it is aluminum sliding over here. And in this area, there are so many places that we haven't looked. And this was one of them. So this year I'm going up and I'm looking every place, because I just never thought there'd be anything in this area. And a lot of the areas are covered with water. The headwaters of the Pigeon is controlled by a dam at the end of this. They're used to float logs. And the water fluctuates. And if we're finding all of these things, I mentioned surface find before. That means that you don't have to dig for them. You can look and see them. But if the water ever would go down in this area, say they released a couple of the logs from the dam, you can just imagine what you would find if we were finding this with the surface find and just a little digging. There is one area up there that is quite interesting. You wonder why all of these things have lasted so long through the centuries. We have one area that we're finding the copper in, and the clay up there has a perfect preservative in it, and as it does for some of the rocks. Ricky has made vases and cups that have not been fired up there, and I'm sure you could drink out of them, and you could probably cook out of them. And this one area is where all of this is so well preserved. I'm going to turn it over to Ricky now, and I think from here we'll go into some of the voyageurs things.
Yeah, the voyageur period, most of this is it predates the voyageur things by almost 1,000 years. But back in the 17th century, the fur traders from Montreal would come up to Grand Portage, and from there they would go on, like I said, this natural watershed that the native people followed down, and they'd go up and they'd be gone for a year at a time, come back with furs, and then rendezvous at the post over here. But some of the artifacts that they used to use, that they would trade with the Indians, are these barbs. Now this is made out of wrought iron. This is about 250 years old, and the voyageurs would carry a pack of these, 92 a pack, and this is what they trade for furs. This was a trade item at the time, and the Indians in turn would again spear beaver, spear fish, use it as their tool. And these are two beauties that Dad found. This is a smaller spear, and I've seen examples. Minnesota Historical Society has a series that they would use a stick like this, and then they'd lash about 4 or 5 of these barbs like this to the bottom of a post, and then they'd spear fish. So that's how these items were used. And this again is a real deteriorating example of that bigger spear. Okay, what you're looking at right now is a beaver pelt. And the beaver pelt at the time of the voyageur was probably the most sought after commodity in this country. And the reason was because fashion in Europe dictated that high hats were the rage and everyone was wearing furs. And so during the 200 years, almost 150 years that the voyageurs were here, their basic commodity was furs. And as I pointed out before, these are the barbs that were traded with the Indians. And these in turn would be used, rather than trapping the beaver, they used to spear beaver. And it didn't really matter how many holes were in the beaver itself, because there was like a felt made out of the beaver. Other trade items we've got here these are pipe stems. And just about everyone in that time used to smoke a long pipe, and the pipe was long and it had a little white bowl, and they were made out of clay. And these were found at the fur trading post itself in, I guess it was 1970. Well, in 1972 I was working at the post on construction, and we were digging foundations, and every once in a while you'd find these pipe stems that apparently was a dump area. And here's parts of the bowls here, and other parts of the stockade that were found is a pewter spoon. And while I was digging too, I found some, some of the beads these were found at the stockade, but these are what the voyageurs traded as well for. Rather than the barbs themselves, they'd trade trinkets with the Indians in trade for beads, and in turn the Indians would use these to decorate their garments. And these are really beautiful beads. This is a hand-blown glass bead, and it's red with little white spots on it. And this is another bead that's just black, but that's blown glass as well. And one of the things I found at the same site, which I think is an artifact from the voyageurs, is a heart. But this is all tooled out of silver, and I don't know if the silver was traded or if the ornament itself was traded, but it's a traditional symbol even today, the sign of the heart. So that's a collection, and we have some really nice stone artifacts over here, but it's fun to collect, like I said before, because it's not so much a hobby, but a real insight into what man was 7,000 years ago to 250 years ago. And these are old artifacts, and I'm sure artifacts of today are going to be like beer cans and flip tops and things that we use every day. And these are what man used every day about 1,000 years ago. And that's it.
I mentioned this before, and I showed this. It just shows you, when you find something like this, how far things can carry on from there. We found this to be a most interesting project hobby, and it's a good family project for us. So from here, we will say goodbye. And the history behind them. We have several areas that are covered here. The stone collection, and we also have the copper collection. That will be explained by my son, Rick. Rick?
I'm Rick Anderson. And before we start, I'd just like to mention that these artifacts are, it's a hobby, but more than a hobby, it's a real interest. And it's interesting because it's a collection of tools used by early man. And man has been on the North American continent now, archaeologists say, for almost 10,000 years. And the way they came down, there was a natural migration route after the glaciers receded, and the land which is now Siberia and Alaska was connected by just the island are some of the largest deposits of native copper in the world. And native copper is copper that has no copper sulfate. It's just pure copper, and so it's easily malleable. It's easy to get to, and there's no refining that has to be done. And I have here a piece of native copper that comes from Isle Royal, and it's solid copper. And the way the people used to get this copper from the island was build a fire next to a big chunk of copper, and this would heat up the copper. Then they'd pour water on it. If there were any rock around it, the rock would shatter, and with a hammerstone pound off this copper until they'd have a chunk like this. And I imagine this is a pretty valuable piece of copper because you could make a lot of artifacts out of it.
Okay, next one. All right, next one. Okay, that's good.
My name is Lou Anderson. Huh? Not yet? Okay, you tell.
Get a little. Get some lead.
My name is Lou Anderson, and I live at Grand Portage, Minnesota. What you see here before you is an artifact collection made by the Indians. We have collected this for about 50
short causeway of land. So supposedly early man walked across there, came down, and followed the natural watershed which starts at Lake Athabasca and ends up at what's called South Fowl Lake. And South Fowl Lake is a site where we found these. And some of our artifacts date from, this is a point, it dates from 4,500 to 7,000 BC. It's a Lancelot point, it's called, and is dated by the Minnesota Historical Society. And other points we have also are that area, but what I'd like to talk about now is the native copper that was found at this site. About 22 miles from Grand Portage is what's called Isle Royal, and Isle Royal is an island, largest island in Lake Superior. And on
15 to 17 years. How we got started on this. This is the first one I found. We were duck hunting in this area, which is the South Fall area, which is the headwaters of the Pigeon River. The first one I found, which is this arrowhead, really excited me because, as you see, it's very perfect. After that, a lot of times I wasn't so fortunate. I'd find pieces that were broken, but still, they mean so terribly much when you consider the work